Okay, we have made it over to chapter 40. And the big question is this. Does Job want to continue with this situation in which he has found himself? So continuing the question, or the discussion, if you want to call it that. I don't know that we can really call it a discussion. If we do, it's kind of a one-sided ordeal. God tells Job, if the one complaining wants to continue his protest, let him answer the previous questions. Now remember, God has laid forth some pretty interesting questions, some pretty deep questions. He asked him about the seabeds, what keeps the sea from overtaking the earth. How is it that the animals, the mammals of the world are able to bring forth their children in a particular season, right? They bring them forth at the proper time that keeps the predators from completely annihilating them. And after a while, a pretty short period of time, the offspring are able to just go off on their own, right? What about the light and the darkness? Where is the holding place for the light? Well, the light doesn't have a holding place. The darkness doesn't have a holding place. But can you explain that to me, Job? And just different things that he puts forth that is beyond the comprehension of people. And so, no one can answer those questions. It's beyond anyone's mind. And so this is a rhetorical question that God is putting forth. So what has happened here is that God has brought up these deep subjects introduced to put Job's mind in the right perspective. He's trying to get his mind headed in the right direction, so to speak, because it hasn't been there up to this point, has it? He hasn't been thinking really in the right way. And so by that happening to Job, do we benefit from that? Well, sure, we're part of the human family, aren't we? We're part of the human family, and because we're part of the human family, we can look at this and we can understand, well, I can't really explain why the animal life or the animal family acts the way in which it acts. Where do these instincts come from? Well, they're just in them, aren't they? God put them there. Or exactly how is it that God can separate darkness from light? Well, I understand how the sun shines on half of the earth, but how is it that he can separate it to where a little bit of it doesn't kind of sneak around the edge? You know, I mean, you know, what keeps the stars from their light coming? Because light travels at a certain speed, right? And so there are some questions that we just simply are not able to answer, though scientists think they can. And it helps us to understand our relationship with God, right? God's the creator, we're the created. That's the bottom line, isn't it? Job quickly came to the realization that he was unfit to make any further kind of statements or complaints. So what did he resolve to do? I'm going to keep my mouth shut. I'm going to put my hand over my mouth, and I am not going to say another word. So he quickly understood that he spoke too soon, he spoke too loud, and he spoke too boldly with his complaints. It's not so much that he complained, it's that he was a little forward with his complaints, wasn't it? He should have been a little softer. So, the facts of the matter are, God has every right to take whatever measures He wants in His universe. It's His operation, and He can control it in whatever way that He sees fit. But here's the thing of the matter. He's a just God, and He's always going to do the right things. Now, things happen in the world And God allows certain things to happen, and certain things that do happen in the world are for our benefit. And we learned that. James talked about trials and tribulations being a benefit to us, right? They help us to become more patient, and they help us to endure. If we can endure trials, the more trials we endure, and we're able to overcome those things, the better able we're to do that in the future than we've been in the past. So just because something happens in someone's life doesn't mean that God is punishing us. It just simply means He allows some things to happen because it is for the benefit of the person. And so God has a right to do that, and He will never do anything that is inconsistent with His nature. Now, Job had argued with his friends and supposed that he could maintain that same argument with God, didn't he? He had argued and he had put forth this great defense, and he said, well, I can do that same thing, or in his mind he thought that, but it is different to try to vindicate oneself with your fellow man than to stand in the very face of God and try to put forth that same type of an argument. And I think that a person would find out pretty quickly, just as Job did, you'll wilt down in a hurry. You're not going to be able to stand up under the pressure of the God of heaven. So we see that God challenges Job, and it wasn't going to be as easy as just Job saying, well, I'm going to shut my mouth, I'm finished. Because God wasn't through with him yet. Job hadn't really learned his lesson. He needed to be humbled just a little bit more. He had a few more questions for the patriarch. So, these questions deal with his creation and how Job would handle two of God's creatures. And this is where we learn a little something about the behemoth and the Leviathan. Now, his confession not having been sufficient for God, the discourse continued. So God tells Job here, and we've heard this previously, He said, gird up your loins, meaning what is about to happen is going to be strenuous for you. This is going to be a little difficult. So get ready and prepare yourself, because he wasn't ready physically, mentally, or emotionally. He just wasn't ready in any sense of the word. So he asked Job this, in essence. He said, Job, would you discredit my judgment and my justice? Is that what you're trying to do? Now that's a pretty bold statement if you're standing in front of God and He's asking that of you, isn't it? Can you imagine the terror that must have been coursing through Job when God said, are you trying to discredit my judgment and my justice? Is that what you're telling me? Because Job is going to come to understand here in just a few moments, all this complaining and all these bold statements, God had been hearing it all along. He knew exactly what Job had been saying. And so the implication is Job is more just than God. Is that what you're saying? You are more just than I am. In that case, God's going to challenge Job to prove it. So his argument is, if you're more just than me, then surely you're more powerful than I am. So let's see the arm of your power. We need you to demonstrate that for us. And of course, throughout the Bible, God's power is demonstrated and indicated. And so he does an amazing thing in that instant. He tells Job to array himself with the attributes of deity. He tells him that. He says, show the Almighty how you would operate in the universe if you were in charge, verses 10 through 11. That is an amazing passage. You put on the attributes of deity. You must be able to do that because of the statements you've been making up to this point. And I want you to demonstrate to me how you would operate in the universe if you were in charge. Well, that's a tall order, isn't it? Well, God is demonstrating to Job that it's not as easy as it appears to be. Because what he's saying is, if I'm not doing it correctly, then you show me how it ought to be done. So looking from the view of God, he is telling Job to consider every proud individual. I want you to pick out a wicked person, and you tell me how you would deal properly with that individual. Now, see, here's the issue. When you deal with an individual, you're not just dealing with that one individual. You're dealing with the people who are alive at that time that are connected to that individual. But you're also having to deal with the people who will come after that individual. And we see that in the lives of the people of the Old Testament, don't we? Examples. What about David? God had to deal with David, but he also had to deal with those who were alive at that time. And we think of particularly 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, when he sinned with Bathsheba. The young child was born. He had to punish David, and he also had to deal with that young child, that baby. But he also had to deal with Bathsheba. And then he had to deal with David's offspring and generation after generation after generation. Job, how would you handle that? He just swallowed hard, didn't he? It's about all he could do. Because he had no idea how he would handle that. Well, I wouldn't know how to handle that. Why didn't God just strike David dead? Why did God send Nathan over there to say it will not cost you your life? Well, thank God that he did offer salvation to David, because what would have happened to all of us if David had been punished with death? Yeah, no Messiah through the lineage of David. That would have been over, wouldn't it? So, when Job is able to perfectly execute judgment and justice, then God will say, Job, you're great. So when was God going to be able to do that? Well, it was never going to happen. Never going to happen. God then mentions the behemoth. Now that is an anglicized form of the Hebrew word behemoth, usually meaning beast in the general term, but in this particular instance it means a particular animal. Now the Bible speaks of that great beast as a plant-eating animal, not as a predator, but not something to be toyed with. You can't mess with this animal. And the description gives insight into his size and type. Well, he eats grass. Other animals can graze near him and not be worried about being harmed. Well, he kind of lays around during the hot part of the day in the shade of the tree. He laps up water from the river. Well, in fact, the description is he just gets out there in the water, and if it appears that the river is just going to come in one big flood, it doesn't bother him at all. He's not worried about that. He is very strongly built and a powerful beast. He has a tail that is so strong and stiff, he moves it as if it were a cedar tree. Does that sound like an elephant or a hippopotamus? Have you seen their tails? There are dogs and cats that have longer tails than a hippopotamus and an elephant. It's not an elephant or a hippopotamus. He is chief or the largest of the ways of God. He is the largest animal. Snares cannot entrap him. He's not one to be hunted. You're not going to set out a snare. You're not going to catch this animal. And so these descriptions that have been provided for us eliminate anything that's alive today. So what in the world could this animal possibly be? He is a dinosaur. Now, evolutionists do not like to hear that. Why? Well, they say that dinosaurs died at least 65 million years before man was ever came out of the cesspool of junk as a single cell something and began to evolve into what he is today. Well, that's not true. The fact of the matter is, Behemoth was a dinosaur. He lived during the time that man lived. In fact, he was created on the same day that God created the first man, Adam. What day was that, by the way? Day 6, right? The last day of God's active creating. And so internal and external evidence points to Job being an inspired writer, and God of heaven, the God of heaven would not support some kind of a pagan myth being recorded in the pages of his book. So this is an actual animal. I have some websites put in your notes here you can go look at that talk about facts concerning dinosaurs and humanity living together. Chapter 41 brings us to the another monster that Job is called to consider and to reflect upon. And that monster is called Leviathan, which some have believed erroneously to have been a crocodile. Well, he has some similarities in his description of a crocodile, but Herodotus recorded that the Egyptians tamed the crocodile. Not only did they tame it, but they put jewelry on the crocodile, and they worshipped the crocodile, and the crocodile kind of hung out in the palace. Now that's not going to sound like something, sound like this Leviathan, because you wouldn't want the Leviathan hanging out in the palace with you. Because the Leviathan is presented as a creature that is beyond being tamed. You cannot tame Leviathan. The word Leviathan has likely been used symbolically, like Psalm 74, Isaiah 27, but it is not used in symbolism in the book of Job. It was some type of an aquatic creature, and the etymology of the word suggests that which is bent or twisted, or that which is folded up upon itself, or gathers itself in its folds. So God asked Job this. He's continuing his questioning of Job. You can't catch Behemoth, so you can't deal with him. Well, what about Leviathan, Job? Can you go out? Can you hook Leviathan? I'm sure Job was very familiar with fishing. He was obviously familiar with the Jordan River. That's where the Behemoth drank. And so Job was familiar. I'm satisfied with fishing. And so he asked him, he said, Job, can you go down and hook Leviathan out of the water? You hook fish. Can you go hook Leviathan? Well, what about this? Can you rope Leviathan? Can you press his tongue down with a cord? Now, what they would often do is they would take that cord and they would wrap that around the lower jaw, and they would press that down. And can you catch an animal? And they would likely catch crocodiles that way. And that's kind of the idea behind that. Can you do that, Job? Well, I don't think Job was up to the task of doing that, because this creature is described as too terrible to approach and too strong to capture. Well, then Job goes on and he asks him, he says, if you are able to capture this animal. Now remember, he's asked Job, he says, now go ahead and clothe yourself in deity. Okay? And I'm going to ask you some questions on how you would operate the universe if you were able. So if you were able to capture Leviathan, do you think that he would softly whisper to you and ask you to let him go? Leviathan wasn't the type of creature to softly whisper anything, was he? He was a terrible creature. He was fierce, and he would terrorize people. Obviously, that answer would be no. His size and strength did not require soft words from such a sea monster. And no one would be able to make a covenant with Leviathan to be able to tame him. And here's the idea behind it. Leviathan was just simply not worth the risk. He wasn't worth the risk. He wasn't good prey, because how are you going to kill him? He laughs at you. If you come at him with spears and arrows, they're like straw. So, he thinks that's humorous. He's not good prey. You couldn't You couldn't deal in his flesh, his skin or his flesh, because he's just too dangerous. So he's just simply not worth the risk. He needs to be avoided. You can't tame that animal, right? So, and that's the way God constructed him. It's just too risky and non-productive. Now, having understood how ferocious Leviathan is, God stops for a moment and he says, let me make this point to you. As terrifying as Leviathan is, I own him. He is in subjection to me. Now, if you can't handle Leviathan, verses 10 through 17, if you can't handle Leviathan, you can't approach Leviathan, you can't capture him, you can't harpoon him, you can't do anything with him, you're terrified of him, in fact, along with everyone else, and I own him, and he's in subjection to me, along with all the rest of the universe. Now, what makes you think that you can question me about how I run the universe? Who are you, Job, to believe for 1 second, as terrified as you are of this one animal, you can't control Behemoth, you can't control Leviathan, what makes you think you can stand up and question me about anything? That's a pretty bold statement to have to answer. Leviathan could not be overpowered. He could not be rendered helpless. He could not be under the authority of any human, and neither could God. God could not be placed under the obligation of any man. And Job had to understand that, and he had to understand that in a quick way. And then he turns his attention back to Leviathan, and he just finishes up 18 through 34, talking about how frightening, just to kind of add a exclamation point on what he just said. You can't handle Leviathan? What makes you think you can stand up to me? And then he talks about how frightening Leviathan is. He says the sea monster streams fire from his mouth and smoke from his nose. I think I've seen movies that kind of sounded like that, haven't you? Now that's what skeptics want us to believe, that is a myth. Now I have seen movies, and I have read stories. Now why do you think that of all the different cultures around the world and all the different races of people that have been separated by oceans and geographic mountains and ways in different times and eras that could not be crossed, they all have legends of what we call fire-breathing dragons? How is that? Because there was an animal that fits that description. Now, someone says that's impossible. Well, first of all, nothing is impossible with God, but there is, and I'm sure y'all have heard about the bombardier beetle. Has two little sections in its tail where it holds hydrogen peroxide and another, I've got it in the notes, I can't remember now what it is, but it mixes those two liquids together and it shoots out a stream of liquid, noxious gases, 212 degrees right into the face of its enemy. Well, if that little bug can do that, why in the world would it be impossible for God to create an animal that would be able to do that very thing? That's a sea creature. This isn't a myth. God can create an animal that can do whatever He wants it to do. his body was created in such a way that it was strong, it fit together, there was nothing soft on it, it was non-yielding, it was just simply a terrifying sea creature. When it went through the water, it left a wake behind it as if it were a huge ship. Can you imagine such an animal? Any comments, questions? All right, Job's repentance and confession, chapter 42. God had demonstrated to Job that he's not missing in action. He is always around. He's always aware of what is going on in the universe. He works in it and he sustains his creation. And he impressed upon Job the majesty and the power pertaining to deity. God does not have an easy job. What he does is not an easy task as we look at it. Nothing is difficult for God. He can do whatever he sets his mind to do. But in addition, he brought Job to the understanding that no one has a right to accuse God of being unrighteous or unjust or any of those other words or descriptions that we can put together that it seems like Job was thinking. And I don't think that Job thought for a second that God was unrighteous or even unjust. He said God had a right to do whatever it was that he wanted to do. But I do believe Job felt that it was unfair that he was suffering the way he suffered because he was a righteous man. Well, it wasn't unfair that things happened to Job the way they happened because that's just the way it goes sometimes. Bad things happen to good people. Instead, what Job needed to understand was people have to learn to trust, to love, and to serve God the way he demands for them to trust, to love, and to serve him without question. We do not have a right to question God. Now, let me rephrase that. We can question God if we're seeking information. We do not have a right to challenge God. That's where it becomes a problem. Okay? God has never forbid anybody from seeking information. But we do not have a right to challenge God. And if we look at Job's attitude there for a period of time, that is where the problem sat. He was challenging the situation. Well, if God will present himself, I will either answer or ask him to answer. Well, that's not the attitude. You don't come before God with that attitude. He's not going to tolerate that for even a second. And we see that he came and he presented himself to Job. And how many answers did Job present? He didn't have even one. But to Job's credit, because he was a very righteous man, he admitted and confessed his guilt of that very first question that God asked. So he went back to that very first question in his confession. Who is he that darkens my counsel? Job said, that was me. I spoke when I didn't understand. I spoke in ignorance. And I am guilty of that sin. So he admitted his wrongdoing. And he admitted that the things of God were too hard for him or anybody to grasp or to understand. And in his lamentation, Job said that he said things that he then regretted. And he admitted that God's questions had this humbling effect upon him. And now, the part that really, for 42 chapters, everybody's been waiting on, God turns his attention to the three friends. And we really would have liked for it to have been a little longer, but God understands that's probably not the correct attitude for any of us to have, so he makes it really a very short statement over the course of verses 7 through 9. But he turns to Eliphaz, and he didn't quite have the same attitude toward Eliphaz that he had toward Job. And he told Eliphaz. He says, my wrath is kindled against you and the other two, because they spoke things that were not true. They spoke things that were not true about God's character or the way things happened in the natural realm of life. Do the righteous, are they always blessed? Well, certainly not. Are the wicked always punished in this life? Absolutely no. But that was the age-old myth and tradition that these three men propagated for all these months or however long that this was going on. And God did not appreciate that. And so, obviously Job had been too forward in his speaking, but these men were treacherous toward Job. They didn't offer any comfort toward him, and they were just mean-spirited. They didn't offer the help, and they never admitted that they were wrong in their charges against him. But here's the thing, and this is a good lesson for everyone that reads the book of Job. When they followed God's directions to make sacrifices and have Job to offer those for them, the way he demanded it, God forgave them, because that was an indication that they admitted guilt on their part if they did it sincerely, and there's no reason for us to believe that they didn't offer that sincerely. Now, what did we want to see? Kind of as we were caught up in this poem of just, it was of greatness. We wanted to see God, or at least I have over the years, God to come with the hammer of wrath and punishment and to drop it and to vindicate Job and to say, come here, I'm going to give you exactly what Job said you would get, what you've given me. And that didn't really happen. But God's a God of mercy and love, and if you repent, thankfully, what does God do? He forgives. Now, if we do not want to see that for Job's friends, we're going to be pretty unlucky ourselves, aren't we? So thankfully, they did do what God asked, and God would have certainly forgiven them. Now, it is a wonderful testament to the character of Job and to the person he is for offering no sacrifices for those men. He certainly did it, and was happy, I'm sure, to do that. He truly is or was a servant of God. And we move into the last 7 or 8 verses of the chapter where God restores Job, and we see the greatness of Job also when he receives his friends and his family. And the first question that comes to my mind is, where were you all along? Where was his sisters and his friends and all those when he was suffering the way in which he suffered? Aren't you supposed to be there for your family and help them through their sickness? And I just see Job sitting out around the fire in a pile of ashes, and he can't get in a place of rest or comfort, and he's just miserable. He wants to die, and I don't read about any family around him, any true friends around him, and I'm thinking, where are all these people? Well, when things get good again, here they come. Well, they bring with them a piece of money and an earring, and that may have been a ancient custom for the time, and it may have helped to offset the cost of this great gathering. But he did welcome them into his home. He didn't rebuke them. We don't read that. Another great testament to him. And in fact, they sat at his table. He fed them. They rejoiced. And God gave him back everything that was taken. In fact, he doubled it, didn't he? Now the question is, or the one that's always kind of been in my mind, what about his children? Did he double his children? How many children did he have to begin with? 10. What were they? 7 boys and 3 girls. So what did he end up when God began to double his stuff? He was given again 7 boys and 3 girls. So how many children did he ultimately end up with? How many? 20. Is that double? He did double them, didn't he? Because God is the God of the living, not the dead, right? Where were those previous 10? Huh? Physically they're dead, but what happened to them?
Great wind blew down the house.
But where did they have an eternal part, right? They went into the Haden realm. They went to paradise, right? Because we have no reason to believe they were unfaithful to God. So if they went into paradise, they're still living. And so he gave them 10 more children. Got 20 children. He doubled them. That's my view of it. You know, if someone thinks otherwise, that's fine. That's my view of it. I have 4 daughters. If my daughters were taken from me, I still have 4 daughters. They're just not in the physical realm any longer. But that doesn't mean they do not exist. What did David say about that child of his we mentioned?
Come back to him, but he can go.
I can go to him. Because his servant says, his servants couldn't understand. He said, all this time you mourned and you wouldn't eat. And now that the child has died, you got up, you bathed, you anointed yourself, you're eating. I don't understand. Well, while he yet lived, who knew? Maybe God would show mercy and the child might live. But now that he's dead, I can't bring him back. I can't go to the child, or I can't bring the child back to me, but one day I can go to the child. So the child lived. The child lived. That's my take on it. Maybe that's more of a happier take on it, but that's the way I look at it. Now, here's something we want to look at as well. Job's daughters. Prettiest girls in the land. Everybody's got a daughter believes that, right? But Job's daughters were the prettiest girls in the land. They did not have anyone superior to their beauty. But in addition to that, they received an inheritance among their brothers. Now, what is so important about that comment? Under the law of Moses, daughters did not receive an inheritance among their brothers unless there were no sons. We see that in Numbers 27, verse 8. So what that tells us is that it is more likely that Job lived during the patriarchal years than he did during the law of Moses. Of course, that's just one thing that tells us that. There are a multitude of insinuations that to me tells me Job was a patriarch. Okay? He shaved his head when he was mourning the loss of his children. That wasn't allowed under the law of Moses. Okay? God didn't rebuke him for that. When we look at his age, Job lived an additional 140 years after all this was over. Well, he had 10 grown children living independent of him. Okay? When this began. He'd had to have been 50 or 60 years old. Somewhere around there when this started. If he had 10 grown children living independent from him, right? Well, if he lived another 140 years, he'd had to have been 190 or 200 years old. How old did the patriarchs live? They lived about that age, right? We see that Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac lived to be 180, Jacob lived to be 147. So that puts him right in there in the age range of the patriarchs. And ultimately, though, Job was blessed with enough age to see his children and his grandchildren. That is particularly unique for Job because he was I hate to say he was an old man because I'm older than 50, and he might have been 50 when this started, but he was an older man when this started, and so for an older man to be 50 or 60 and then begin to have children and still see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that's quite a feat. So God certainly blessed him, and Job was, of course, an amazing individual. Any comments or questions? Do you have any questions over this exam that is set before you? We have just a few minutes. We can talk a little bit about it. What's that? Okay, the deadline, a couple weeks. Does that sound all right?